This is a very fireside chat feel to it. Gather round, children.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much for sticking around to spend a little time with us. If we get it up and running, great. If not, that's okay. So today, let me walk you through kind of what we're going to do here. In order to talk about disability and the church, first we're going to take a little look down history lane, okay? Because it's important to understand the landscape of disability today to see where we've been and to understand how we got to where we are, all right? So if we can move to the next slide, great. If not, that's okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the past and the context of history of disability that has gotten us to this point. And then we're going to look at that in terms of context as people of the church and looking at it through the lens of people of faith. We have to look at where we've been to understand where we are, and then we're going to look at where we're going. We're going to talk about this particular congregation. We're going to talk about the church as a whole, and then we're going to talk about here at Ben Avon and look at the different ways that we have moved toward accessibility and the ways that we still have areas to grow. If we could, next slide, I would appreciate it. Wonderful. So, thank you, dear. Wonderful. So, part of the history of folks with disabilities is the history of institutions. It's important to keep in mind that people with disabilities aren't typically a part of everyday out and about life. And there's a history for that. You see, oftentimes people would be put in institutions, or another word for them might be asylums, places where these people it was supposed to help them, but more often than not, it was a place, it was more like a prison. These places where folks with varying, some of them were mental health issues, some of them were physical disabilities. A lot of the time, if someone's condition made it so that they could not speak, they assumed that the person had no intelligence, and so would just kind of be sent away somewhere. All of this changed when a wonderful woman and Christian by the name of Dorothea Dix, she was a nurse. And one of the things that she did is she surveyed a number of these asylums, a number of these institutions, and realized very quickly that they were not living up to the medical standard that would have actually helped them to lead lives, not just within the community of the asylum, but just a better quality of life. Actually, a number of institutions were reformed based on research she conducted, where she went into these places and saw these things for herself and wrote new ways of creating communities. This is a person of faith who saw the belovedness of these people and said, we need to do better by them. Next slide, please.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please. This is an open conversation. Feel free to stop me anytime with questions.
Any of you local folks have a special connection to Dixmont? Did you work there or wander through there at any point?
Dixmont is named for Dorothea Dix. This would have been the 18, I want to say 40s or 50s. Probably. I know she was a nurse in the Civil War. I don't know when in her journey she did these institutional reforms, but that was certainly a part of it. And actually, as part of that, thank you, you lead me nicely into my next point. And that's that we're looking at, on this slide, I'm going to walk us through a little bit here, of some Keystone, Pennsylvania, legislative moves that really paved the way for for people with disabilities. And we're going to start with the 1867, when there were laws known as unsightly beggar laws, or the ugly laws. Now, these were discriminatory in nature. These laws made it so that if you had any kind of deformity, if you were homeless, if you were unkept, if you were unsightly in any way, you could not be seen in public. You would be punished. You could be arrested. So it was not even legal for us to be seen in public. So where did we go? We had to go somewhere. We went to institutions, right? And that's how we got there. And over time, those traditions began to fade, but not quite soon enough. You see, these ugly laws, for lack of a better term, were still in practice and were only reformed in 1974. And these laws existed in a lot of major capitals and cities in the country, like Chicago, San Francisco, and Denver. I could not find specific enough information to understand whether or not laws like this were in place here in Pittsburgh, but given the presence of places like Dixmont and others, I would assume that if it wasn't in the legal books, it certainly was in the practiced social books.
That sounds like how they treat lepers in Hawaii.
It does, doesn't it? They're separated from their communities because they're untouchable, right? The funny thing, I'm glad you bring up leprosy. It's interesting because we talk about, you're taught in Sunday school that leprosy, when they talk about it in the Bible, is like Hansen's disease, right? It's a very specific, yes and no. Leprosy, when we're talking about the Bible, is a very general term for a skin irritant of any kind. So ichthyosis would be leprosy. Eczema would be leprosy. Alopecia would be leprosy. And, things that they thought would be contagious to other people, whether they understood the science of that or not. And as we move through the timeline, as people are coming out of World War II in 1945, we get the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now this piece of legislation was about a whole lot more than just people with disabilities. This was about bringing the country back to economic life again after the war. And so there was a section of that law called Section 14C. And when it was written, it was designed to encourage employers to hire disabled veterans who had returned from the war. Now, what this actually did was any business can file for and receive what's called a Section 14C certificate. And what this does is it allows the employer to pay their disabled employees what we call a sub-minimum wage. It allows them to pay their disabled employees a fraction through a really bizarre calculation of how much they can produce as it compared to an able-bodied employee of the same job. Now, I wish I could tell you that this disappeared. I can't. That law is still on the books. And there are companies still thriving today that have a Section 14C certificate. Some of these places are what we call sheltered workshops. Now, part of asylum work and these, we had to find something for these people to do, to spend their days doing. So these places cropped up where they might shred paper or sort bolts or do a variety of other medial, mindless tasks that don't really, they're not meant to be filling, they're meant to fill time. And, and by the way, they can be paid up to 75 cents an hour in some places, depending. That's still legal. And these places are still practicing, even in Pennsylvania. I'll get to my day job work in a second, but it's important to recognize that we are moving away from this kind of sheltered workshop, put people with disabilities in their own little segregated corner kind of model. We're moving towards what we call competitive integrated employment, which means that someone with a disability is earning a wage that is competitive to their disabled and non-disabled peers in the field, and that they are integrated, meaning they are working with folks who do and do not have disabilities in their workplace. So we're slowly getting there, but these old chains are still holding on. And there's a law here that I didn't actually put on the screen that I am going to mention, called the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This created the landscape that allowed for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act that came later. The Rehab Act made it illegal to discriminate against people with disability for the use of federal funds, meaning, finally, people with disabilities could benefit from federal programs without discrimination. And this opened a whole wide door, particularly in the realm of education. Now, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was first passed in its early form in 1975, this made it standard for every student identified with a disability to receive free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. This laid the groundwork for students with disabilities to go to school today, in order to help make sure those students were able to receive a free and appropriate, meaning it was on par, it was challenging in the same way that education is challenging for students without disabilities. So too, do they want to allow for not just the buildings, the physical spaces, but also the curriculum to be integrated and accessible. And so in order to do that, we began what are called IEPs, or Individualized Education Plans. And what these do is they say, I'll use myself as an example, I have a hard time sweating because of my skin condition. My skin doesn't allow me to sweat properly, and so I can overheat very, very easily. Now, in an old school building that doesn't have central air, in the hot days of late September and the hot days of late June or May, that can be very dangerous for me. And so I need certain accommodations in order for me to stay in the classroom with my disabled and non-disabled peers, right? And so that's what that IEP is designed to do. So all of that stuff, we're chipping away at these old traditional structures of keeping people with disabilities in their own little corner, but we're not fully there yet because they can't access physical public places. That's where the ADA comes in. The ADA passed in 1990, right? Yes, check my notes. Passed in 1990, allowed for public accommodations. So any public building, with some exceptions that we'll get to in a minute, had to be able to be accessed by a person with a disability. Oftentimes, that required a number of alterations to the space to allow for that, because many of these spaces were not built for people with mobility issues, people with hearing disabilities, people with visual impairments in mind. So when we talk about the kinds of people that are affected by all of this, next slide please, we get to, and I gave us a definition of disability in the sermon, but I want to kind of look at this again, because I think it's really important. So the definition I gave you before was from the Center for Disease Control, which is somewhat based on this one, from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'm going to read this out loud. An individual with a disability is defined by the ADA as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Thank you. A person who has a history or a record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. I think those three categories are important. It is having the condition itself, it is having the history of having had that condition, but it's also about how other people perceive you. If they think you are not capable, you might as well not be capable. Next slide, please. But the interesting part about this is it looks like a small portion of the population. According to this was a 2020 study by Pew, about 13% of the population of the United States today has a disability as identified under the ADA. But that's over 42 million people. And those are people who would self-identify, meaning folks who are already kind of aware enough to be able to say, no, that describes me in some capacity. But really, remember that disability is a category that anyone can fall into at any time. Your body is only as strong as it is in its current form. Life happens, things change, our bodies change over time. And so disability is the category that you could fall into or fall out of just about at any point, from any racial background, any sexual orientation, all of those other intersections of life. Disability covers that entire spectrum. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the church and disability, I think it's really important we talked about those different laws. It's important to understand that the church wasn't always on the side of more access for people with disabilities. We had friends like Dorothea Dix who believed in that social model and making society a wider, more accessible place, but most of the church wasn't on her side of things. You see, when the ADA was going through Congress, churches and religious organizations lobbied against it because they didn't want to spend the money on the accommodations and changes that would have been necessary to those spaces. In addition to that, certain religious groups lobbied against the ADA because it protected people with HIV and AIDS, because a large majority of those people fell into the LGBTQ population. So for a number of different reasons, depending on which side you sat on, the ADA was not a piece of legislation that religious organizations particularly liked. And people with disabilities took notice of that. In all this time, I've been in a number of different churches from a number of different places over the course of my life, and only a handful are such that a person like Michael could get to the pulpit. In addition to the physical limitations of accessibility, there's also social ones. So I mentioned in my sermon about how people with disabilities sometimes are accosted in public by people who really want to help in the way that they think they're helping. They see someone who they think is in pain and they want to do something about it. It is coming from a good place, and at the same time, it tells me I am not wanted as I am in that space. When we read passages like the one this morning from John, and take your pick of healing narratives, Jesus and the woman with the affliction of blood, Jesus and the man with the withered hand, Jesus and 4 different blind people over the course of multiple gospels, right? Jesus encounters disability everywhere. And because we often think of disability as the problem, and he goes in and he makes the disability go away, we think, oh, well, disability clearly is not designed to be in the kingdom of God. And that is, I think, the worst way you could read that. Because instead, what Jesus is doing is he is bridging a gap, as we talked about before. But a lot of churches today still live in that, well, once you're healed, then you can be whole kind of mentality. And that's not how I choose to see myself. That's not how you choose to see yourself. That's not how people with disabilities out and about in the world, we don't think of ourselves as things to be fixed, but people with gifts and talents to be loved and embraced. All of these complex and nuanced conversations kind of bubble underneath the surface, right? We don't talk about those things. We don't name them. And part of it, I think, is because a lot of us don't live with it on a daily basis. When you live with it and you see it every day, it's hard to not notice it. But for those of us that, for one reason or another, aren't impacted by it, haven't seen the day-to-day realities of it, it can appear as though that's how it should be. If you go through your life, a term that I found in my research is called normate bias, which essentially means whatever is I am thinking that whatever is normal for me, for my body, for my life, then that must also be normal for other people. And when what is normal for other people is not what is normal for me, I think that's strange, and I don't want to be a part of that. That's called normate bias. And I think that colors a lot of this history of disability, not just in the church, but in wider society, right? And that's true of people with neurodiversities, that's true of all sorts of different types of disability. But I think it's important to think about and remember the difference between healing and wholeness. Jesus may or may not heal a particular affliction, but that person was already whole before Jesus even set foot into that conversation. Next slide. So now we get to open this up and have a real conversation. You see, we've done a lot of talking about the grand big picture, right? We've talked about where disability kind of started in this country and in society, and we've gotten to today. And so now, knowing all of what we've just talked about and thinking about those things, now I want you to look at where you are now through the lens of what we just talked about. So this is where I get to bring in my friend Michael, and thank you for your patience. I'm sorry I'm standing here blabbering on.
No, it's, first of all, thank you for coming, Hunter. We've never met before, but I've, as I said, heard a lot about you from Cassie, and you truly are as delightful as she says you are.
Well, thank you.
And, so for those of you who know me, you know that if I'm in a meeting or a Bible study or whatever it is, I usually end up bringing up disability issues and social justice issues basically at the drop of a hat. Because I believe that my very existence is political. So I see me existing in this space is a political act.
Amen.
And I don't just mean that in terms of candidates and voting and all that, which is important, by the way. But that's only one part of being political. And of course, my time here has been colored by the fact that when I first came here, it was in the before time, before the pandemic. And if you had said to me, oh, well, there's going to be this global plague that's going to hit the earth, and the only way that you can stay connected is by doing Bible study and book discussions and, watching the services online and doing all this stuff on Zoom, and even before that, WebEx. Remember WebEx? That was fun, wasn't it? That was when we really didn't have any idea what we were doing. And, I like to remind people that this very sanctuary that we're sitting in today was closed for an entire year during the original lockdown. I remember when we originally closed the church, Mary Whittle texted me and said, "See you in 3 weeks." And that turned into a year. And so, I don't want to make this all about the pandemic, but I have said to many of you that you got me through the pandemic, man. And it's still going on, obviously, because we just had some people get COVID again. So it's still out there. It's not gone. But still, we're all in this together. And one of the other things that jumped to mind when Hunter was talking that I think it's important is that when the ADA was passed, I was 5 years old. The ADA is in my lifetime, and it is literally as old as my brother. My brother was born in 1990, and he's somehow an adult. Don't ask me how that happened, but he is. Every July, we celebrate the passage of the ADA, and go back and you can find the signings ceremony on YouTube. And for those of you who are alive, you remember that Poppy Bush, as I like to call him, signed that law. And he's what we call, or was, a Republican. And, not to get too political, but I don't think any of the Republicans running for president today would sign that law. And, we have to remain vigilant in protecting it because it was not a perfect law to begin with. And as Hunter pointed out, churches lobbied against it, and they're also exempt in a lot of ways. Yeah. And we, as a building, are not immune from that. I've had many conversations about getting an automatic button on the Ross Draver door, which hopefully we will do sooner rather than later, but we've literally been talking about it since the pandemic. So even knowing that there's a problem, getting to the point where we actually fix it can still be sometimes a hurdle.
Absolutely, and if I can jump in, there's a few things you talked about that I want to highlight. You mentioned the pandemic, and I think it's really important to note that a lot of people now all of a sudden fall into this category of disability and they didn't before they got COVID.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. And if I could just underline that for a second. The COVID is a mass disabling event.
Yes.
The long COVID is a disability. And guess what? It is a smorgasbord of stuff because there's a lot of different effects that people can have long term. And every time I read about them, well, I'm equal parts heartbroken and terrified because it really does seem like COVID can do just about anything it wants to the human organ. Like, there's not any system of the body that COVID hasn't been found to mess with certain people. And I don't think we have wrapped our brains around, as a society, what that actually means to have that many people suddenly disabled in many different ways.
Yep. And what's funny about that, I find it funny in kind of a karmic way, maybe. I don't know. I probably shouldn't say that. But anyway, that people who now suddenly find themselves in this category of disability and they see this landscape that we just talked about and they're like, this is ridiculous. How do you put up with it? We can't stand for this. And it's just like, hi, welcome to the community. You're right, it's awful. Let's, come over here, have some cookies. And to kind of go along with that, Michael, you talked about, how long it takes for these little changes, for these little accommodations. And I think part of that boils down to, well, we think it only helps a particular kind of person. And we think that that is such a small group that it is more costly to do it than it would be to not, possibly. And first of all, I think that is demonstrably false in a number of ways, because elevators don't just help people who need an assistive device to walk. Automatic doors don't just help people who can't open the door because they physically can't open the door. Ramps don't just help people with, these accommodations they do have particular, very active assistance for people who are immediately impacted by it, and at the same time, they widen the entire community's ability to interact with each other. And when we talk about the ADA in particular, I think it's important to note that it is not the gold standard of accessibility. It never was. It's the bare minimum. Get the person in the space. It doesn't tell you anything about what to do once they're there. And that's where our job comes in. So I'm wondering, Michael, if you could tell me a little bit about what you found being here. You said when we talked earlier that you started attending here 6 years ago, is that correct?
Something like that.
Something like that?
It was, it's funny. Some of you have heard this story before, but Hunter hasn't, so...
Yes, please, tell me. I love your story.
Yes, I had just recently moved to a slightly different neighborhood. I literally went from one road in Kilbuck to the other side of Kilbuck. So it's like 10 minutes away. And and Kilbuck, for those of you who don't know, is a township in the North Hills. It's basically in the middle of the woods. So I moved from Iker Road, where Marty lives, hi Marty, to Newgate Road, which is like literally the other side. And when I did, I met this guy named Joe Angelelli, who sadly is not here today because he is at a political fundraiser, speaking of being political, but he was my neighbor, and we started talking, and he invited me to come to church, and I didn't even think that it was this building because, for those of you who don't know, I grew up in Van Haven, but I was raised in the Roman Catholic Church, so I went to Sacred Heart in Emsworth, which is now something else. They just merged. Thank you, Pope. Um, um, but I like Pope Francis. He's pretty cool. He actually has a soft spot, particularly for kids with disabilities.
Yes.
If you've ever seen video of him on a trip, if he sees a kid in a wheelchair, he will go out of his way to talk to them. And I've always admired that about him. So when Joe first asked me, I was like, nah, because I'd gone to a Episcopal church in college for a time, and I liked that because it was sort of Catholic, but not really. But then after I graduated, I was like, I just sort of fell away because I'd done the American Catholic thing of, oh, well, I have the reins now. Well, let me just tie them over here on this pole, and I'll just see you later, horse of faith. So, for those of you who heard the story, you know where this is going. Joe famously had to ask me 3 times to come here before I said yes. And as I once told our erstwhile Pastor Donna, that was my Peter denying Jesus moment. And it's funny, I was telling Donald over the summer that I was trying to remember the exact date of when I first came here. And I knew it was in the summer because we were in Fellowship Hall, but I couldn't remember the exact dates. And that's because when I set foot in that door, I didn't think that was going to change the rest of my life. I just thought, oh, I'll come on a Sunday morning and make Joe happy, and that'll be it.
God had other plans.
He did. He said, wait until you hear the sermons of Donna Giver Johnston. You're not going to want to leave because she is a genius in the pulpit, which she is, which is why we're sad she's gone, but we're glad that she is using her talents elsewhere. So I was like, there's something really going on here. And this was the beginning of the Trump years, so there was something reassuring about strong female leadership, not to put too fine a point on it, because I had thought we were going to have that in 2017, and we ended up not having it. And so then when I found it here, I was like, this is great. So I found myself immediately embraced by this community, which is one of the things I continue to marvel at even all these years later, that all of you just love me. You just love me, and it's oh, thank you. Yes, you like me, you really like me. But it's true, like, you guys just, grab me and I'll be, And so when, and I do want to make this point before we run out of time, because it's funny, because I originally thought, oh, I'll never become a member. Why would I do that? And then I did. And then I realized, oh, wait, I'm one of the few people under 40 around here. Not for much longer, sadly. But I was like, oh, once I figured out what an elder was, I was like, oh, they're going to ask me. And they did. And actually, when Donna texted me to set up a Zoom meeting, she didn't say what she wanted to talk about. And I was like, I felt like I was being called to the principal's office. I was like, what did I do? But because she didn't elaborate, I was like, oh, the bat signal's going up. It's happening. And because I had the demographic hint that I was probably going to be asked, I had already had plenty of time to think about it. And part of the reason I said yes is that when you're part of a marginalized community, it is important to take a seat at the table when you can get it. And sometimes you have to demand it. And I was lucky enough to be invited very cordially to just pencil away 3 years of my life. But, because, when they first ask you, you're like, I don't know what I'm going to be doing in 3 years. I really know what I'm doing tomorrow. Like,
Word.
But I, and I heard, grumblings from other elders about how hard it can be. And it's not always easy, but I truly, I'm about midway through my first term, and I really have enjoyed every moment of it because, and that's why I'm glad that we are in this time of transition, because guess what? One day, my friend Donald is going to come to me and he's going to say, we found the person. And I'm going to be like, great. And then he's going to take that to session and we're going to vote on it. And I get a vote.
Yes.
And I talked about voting earlier, and I really do believe that voting is sacred. It is precious, it is sacred. And that's one of the reasons I care deeply about voting rights, is because there is nothing more precious in a democracy than the ballot. And for all of the flaws of the Presbyterian Church, there's a committee for everything,
Yep.
which can be a little unwieldy. But you know what? We vote on things, and we believe in the collective, and I like that. And so we all get a say in what happens next. And I know there's uncertainty about what's coming next, but you know what? I'm actually trusting that the people that we picked for the PNC are actually going to do this crazy thing of following the Holy Spirit. Because one of the things I like to say is that when Jesus was first recruiting, he said, come and see. He didn't say what you were going to see. He just said, come on. You coming? And, I do want to quickly mention that one of the things we didn't read in today's passage, I think it's the same passage where, because we read that in Bible study a few months ago, that the people that are ostracizing the blind man actually go to his parents and say, hey, your blind son is causing some trouble. You're his parents, so you have to speak for him. And they're like, no, we don't. He can talk for himself. And I did want to mention that before we run out of time, because my mother can tell you that so many people have spoken to her about me as opposed to me. And that is a key to the disabled experience, is that people often feel like, well, you're significantly other than me, so there's this other person who clearly has authority over you, so I'm going to talk to them instead, because that makes me feel comfortable. And I'm just glad that that is such a universal experience that it's actually in the gospel.
Yes.
And I liked what Hunter said about, because I had read a devotional that said something similar about Jesus being both wounded and whole at the same time, because it is worth remembering that, yes, he triumphs over death and he is resurrected, but his wounds are not magically healed. They're still there. The evidence of man's inhumanity to man is still there, even after he raises from the dead. And I actually think that's why it's important that he shows it to the disciples, particularly Thomas, who I don't think actually doubted anything. He was told, hey, we had a party without you.
Yeah.
And Jesus was there, and it was really awesome.
He thought he was walking into a prank.
Yeah, and he was like, you had a party without me. I want to hang out with Jesus. And so Jesus said, sure. You call my name, I'm like Beetlejuice. Jesus, 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 here I am.
If I can take some of the really important nuggets that you said and kind of weave them together, you talked about the part later on in the passage from John chapter 9. And actually, if you read that whole story, it's beyond chapter 9. I think that whole thing goes to like chapter 11. There's like a whole kerfuffle about this man who was born blind and Jesus healing him. And, well, was he ever really blind to begin with? Was this just an elaborate fake? That's why they bring in his parents.
Yeah.
And I think what they say is really important. No, we don't speak for him. He is his own person. Ask him. And because we, in our Presbyterian polity, put such importance on the communal decision making and who is at the table, it is important that we have folks like myself and Michael and others at that table. Because one of the key phrases of the disability community, of the disability rights movement, is nothing about us without us. Nothing that has to do with us making decisions for our lives without consulting us as people and being equal partners in that conversation. Because just as everyone has things to contribute, so too do we. Can we move on to that next slide for a second? And a lot of what we've talked about, a lot of the issues and problems and challenges that we run into are not ours alone to deal with. We don't have to go through this whole thing by ourselves. The good news is that you are not the only church that is having these conversations. You are not the only community that is trying to figure out what this means. You do this in community with not just yourselves and your community, but the wider church, the wider presbytery, the wider country, as we figure out what these new things look like. There we go. I'm going to have you switch real quick in a second, so just be aware. And part of not doing it alone is that you're not left to find the resources and the tools to do it by yourself. You're not expected to have all the answers, because I don't have all the answers. Next slide. And part of not having all the answers is knowing where to go to for them. So here's some things that are important. And these are hyperlinks, so these links can be shared and documented for later. So first things first, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. We got to work on rewording that. The Office of Vocational Resources is what I'm going to call it. I, in my day job, outside of pastoral stuff and preaching, I work in partnership with OVR and the Pennsylvania Bureau of Special Education. And part of what OVR does, they do a lot of different things. But most importantly is they help people with disabilities to find that competitive, integrated employment that we talked about earlier in their communities and with other people. And one of these places, these sites as we call them, where people with varying abilities can learn on-the-job tasks of time management and how do I sort this out and how do I follow this recipe and whatever it is. One of those sites is Cookie Ice Cream, whose cookies you guys enjoyed earlier. Now, those cookies were made by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They have a fully functional, the cookies that were there was a small fraction of the wide variety of cookies and ice creams and muffins and pastries and cannolis and coffees and all kinds of crazy stuff. And this place is a place of refuge for people to figure out, maybe I want to go into cooking and baking, and maybe it's not for me at all. Where they learn time management skills, where they learn how to interact with their communities. So you can be a place where people with disabilities come to both experience community in the worship sense, but also experience it in the workplace sense. So if in any way you're interested in that, I've included the phone number to the Pittsburgh District Office of OVR. They're a great resource, even if you're not in a position to do any hiring or anything like that, or if you just want to have someone kind of on the back burner, they're a great person to have. In addition to that, we talked about making physical alterations to the building space. We talked about an automatic door and a few other things. You are not alone in trying to find funding for those things. I've included a couple of links to existing grants and grant funding sources that help nonprofits and community centers be more accessible places. In addition to funding the actual nuts and bolts of it, they can help you get connected to other communities. In addition to that, and kind of one of those grants is tied to the thing I'm talking about next, which is the Administration for Community Living. So remember, the church is a community. We are part of the wider community of this neighborhood. We are part of the wider community of Pittsburgh itself. And part of being people with disabilities is we want to also live in the community. So the Administration for Community Living is a place that, an organization, that specializes in community living for people with disabilities, helping them to find housing that is accessible and within their communities, helping them to, in partnership with OVR and a bunch of all of these acronyms, they all work together in a weird alphabet soup that even I can't quite parse. Right, exactly. But the important part to keep in mind is just that you guys aren't the only ones who are having these really sometimes challenging conversations, and that's okay. There are places that can help you continue the conversation as you figure out what your next steps include, as you search for a new spiritual guide, as well as you find your own path. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time today to have a little bit of this conversation with me. And Michael, I can't begin to thank you enough for just how amazing it is that so many people want to actively have this conversation.
Well, I for one just want to quickly say one of the reasons I was glad that you were coming is because even though I've been banging this drum for a few years, I can only speak to my specific situation. I am a wheelchair-using, almost middle-aged white guy who has a middle-class upbringing. And even I have had to learn that there is a broader spectrum of disability than just wheelchair users. I've really had to learn about invisible disabilities, chronic illness, neurodivergence. There is a lot more that does not speak to my specific situation, and I was just glad to have Hunter here because it helps to have somebody else carry the yoke every so often. And you know, it's also just nice to have a woman's perspective because I'm a dude, and like, you know, it's just I try to be an open-minded, sensitive dude, but I'm still a dude, so like, there's shortcomings with that, and I'm just glad that you all have stuck around this long because I love every single one of you in this room, and you know, we probably should see if there's any questions. I know
Yes.
we're running out of time, but there's got to be at least a few.
Right. You can go to the next slide. It's just a thank you slide. But yeah, are there any questions that we can answer? Anything that's percolating? Anything? Bueller. Yes.
I'll just start. The grants that you, I'm sorry, I missed the first part because I had a deacon.
That's okay.
Got it? Deacon, Ron, got it. But are all of those sorts of grants available to religious organizations?
As far as I know, I would encourage you to reach out to those sources in particular and inquire. But in looking for those, I tried to find ones that included nonprofits and religious organizations. Short answer, probably. Long answer, ask them.
And just real quick follow-up. And again, they've already talked about this, and I'm sorry for keeping it.
That's okay.
But is there a service, a person, maybe you, I mean, I don't know, who could actually like walk through a church building and just sort of say, okay, and thinking about all the things, because you know, Michael has opened our eyes into all the ways this building is not as accessible as we might, you know, like you said, ADA, right? Is there somebody who can help us think through this, all of those sorts of things?
That's a good question. Actually, OVR is a great place to start. Part of what they do is they just did this for a friend of mine who works for my home church, who is a wheelchair user. They'll come in and assess your space and understand, you know, for an employee with certain needs, these are the kinds of things they might need, and also they can help you get those things. As far as you know, just a general kind of look through this, you know, that might be an issue, that might be an issue. I'm happy to walk through and talk with you about that. Part of it is every person with a disability's lens and experience is different. So what I notice might be different from what Michael notices, might be different from what Cassie notices, might be different. So it's important to kind of seek that perspective from multiple sources within the disability circle to kind of get a rounded picture. Yes?
What obstacles and, on the other hand, what blessings have you seen come your way as a pastor in the ministry? Like what holds you back and what allows you to do things that other people might not do?
That's an interesting question. As far as blessings, many and rich. I have been extremely blessed to kind of walk into a space where there's not a lot of precedent, at least in the Pittsburgh Presbytery, for disability ministry in its kind of specifics. So there's a lot of new ground to be broken, and so in a way that is both a blessing and a barrier because there's no precedent. And so as kind of was mentioned earlier, I'm a candidate for ordination to the Minister of Word and Sacrament. I'm in stage 2 of 3. Eventually, we'll get there. But part of the way we ordain is we ordain to something that exists. We ordain to a faith community that is practicing, or we ordain to a chaplaincy that exists. And so what that means, for those of us in positions where things are new, it means I have to kind of make the space that I want to be ordained to before I can be ordained to it. So in a way, that's both a blessing and barrier. And overall, to get to meet so many people from so many different places and backgrounds and experiences, and to really continue to peel back the layers of this weird, strange, diverse church that we call home is a blessing that I rejoice greatly over. Other questions, other thoughts, concerns?
You mentioned about ramps to help people in wheelchairs.
Yes.
My husband was visually handicapped
Mhm.
and blind,
Mhm.
and he used ramps because the sunlight was he couldn't visualize steps
Uh-huh.
in the sun. So he used ramps so that he wouldn't have to trip over steps.
Mhm.
Like he could never walk up those steps
Yeah.
because they all blend together for him.
Yep.
So that's another use of ramps that you don't think about, which happens.
Yes. And, those little, almost, so small that if it doesn't affect you, you don't notice them, right? And, that works in multiple ways, and kind of reaffirming what we talked about, that adaptations that you think are designed for one very specific purpose actually serve a much wider net than we initially realize. Any other questions, comments, concerns, small memos? Yes.
I just want to thank you for your time and all that you shared. This has been informative and wonderful and eye-opening, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.
It's been a long morning, and I'm sure you're exhausted, but before we split, could you just pray for
Of
us?
course.
Can we all stand up?
Of course.
Steve Hunters, another blessing.
Yes, please. Friends, would you pray with me? Wounded and whole God, who made all of us in the image of love, we thank you for this day and this time together. We thank you for all of the abilities that we share, that we bring to your common table. We thank you that in all of our ups and downs and learnings, that you journey alongside us. We thank you that in all that we do, we might reflect the love that you pour into the world through your Son, Jesus Christ. We pray that as we go from this place, as we continue these conversations to better understand and include our neighbors, that you might go with us, that we might see in them your face, your love, and your peace. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Hymns are too sweet.
Hello.